Chapter 2. A few days later, the humorist and his wife, with minds greatly relieved, moved into a small furnished house placed at their free disposal in another part of London, and John Silence, intent upon his approaching experiment, made ready to spend a night in the empty house on the top of Putney Hill. Only 2 rooms were prepared for occupation, the study on the ground floor and the bedroom immediately above it. All other doors were to be locked, and no servant was to be left in the house. The motor had orders to call for him at 9 o'clock the following morning. And meanwhile, his secretary had instructions to look up the past history and associations of the place and learn everything he could concerning the character of former occupants, recent or remote. The animals, by whose sensitiveness he intended to test any unusual conditions in the atmosphere of the building, Dr. Silence selected with care and judgment. He believed, and had already made curious experiments to prove it, that animals were more often and more truly clairvoyant than human beings. Many of them, he felt convinced, possessed powers of perception far superior to that mere keenness of the senses common to all dwellers in the wilds where the senses grow specially alert. They had what he termed animal clairvoyance, and from his experiments with horses, dogs, cats, and even birds, he had drawn certain deductions, which, however, need not be referred to in detail here. Cats, in particular, he believed, were almost continuously conscious of a larger field of vision, too detailed even for a photographic camera, and quite beyond the reach of normal human organs. He had further observed that while dogs were usually terrified in the presence of such phenomena, cats, on the other hand, were soothed and satisfied. They welcomed manifestations as something belonging peculiarly to their own region. He selected his animals, therefore, with wisdom, so that they might afford a differing test, each in its own way, and that one should not merely communicate its own excitement to the other. He took a dog and a cat. The cat he chose, now full grown, had lived with him since kittenhood, a kittenhood of perplexing sweetness and audacious mischief. Wayward it was, and fanciful, ever playing its own mysterious games in the corners of the room, jumping at invisible nothings, leaping sideways into the air, and falling with tiny moccasined feet onto another part of the carpet, yet with an air of dignified earnestness, which showed that the performance was necessary to its own well-being, and not done merely to impress a stupid human audience. In the middle of elaborate washing, it would look up, startled, as though to stare at the approach of some invisible, cocking its little head sideways and putting out a velvet pad to inspect cautiously. Then it would get absent-minded and stare with equal intentness in another direction, just to confuse the onlookers, and suddenly go on furiously washing its body again, but in quite a new place. Except for a white patch on its breast, it was coal-black, and its name was Smoke. Smoke described its temperament as well as its appearance, its movements, its individuality, its posing as a little furry mass of concealed mysteries, its elfin-like elusiveness, all combined to justify its name, and a subtle painter might have pictured it as a wisp of floating smoke, the fire below betraying itself at 2 points only, the glowing eyes. All its forces ran to intelligence, secret intelligence, the wordless, incalculable intuition of the cat. It was, indeed, the cat for the business in hand. The selection of the dog was not so simple, for the doctor owned many, but after much deliberation he chose a collie called Flame from his yellow coat. True, it was a trifle old, and stiff in the joints, and even beginning to grow deaf, but, on the other hand, it was a very particular friend of Smoke's, and had fathered it from kittenhood upwards, so that a subtle understanding existed between them. It was this that turned the balance in its favor, this and its courage. Moreover, though good-tempered, it was a terrible fighter, and its anger, when provoked by a righteous cause, was a fury of fire and irresistible. It had come to him quite young, straight from the shepherd, with the air of the hills yet in its nostrils, and was then little more than skin and bones and teeth. For a collie it was sturdily built, its nose blunter than most, its yellow hair stiff rather than silky, and it had full eyes, unlike the slit eyes of its breed. Only its master could touch it, for it ignored strangers and despised their pattings, when any dared to pat it. There was something patriarchal about the old beast. He was in earnest, and went through life with tremendous energy and big things in view, as though he had the reputation of his whole race to uphold, and to watch him fighting against odds was to understand why he was terrible. In his relations with Smoke he was always absurdly gentle. Also, he was fatherly, and at the same time betrayed a certain diffidence or shyness. He recognized that Smoke called for strong yet respectful management. The cat's circuitous methods puzzled him, and his elaborate pretenses perhaps shocked the dog's liking for direct, undisguised action. Yet, while he failed to comprehend these tortuous feline mysteries, he was never contemptuous or condescending, and he presided over the safety of his furry black friend somewhat as a father, loving but intuitive, might superintend the vagaries of a wayward and talented child. And in return, Smoke rewarded him with exhibitions of fascinating and audacious mischief. And these brief descriptions of their characters are necessary for the proper understanding of what subsequently took place. With Smoke sleeping in the folds of his fur coat, and the collie lying watchful on the seat opposite, John Silence went down in his motor after dinner on the night of November 15th. And the fog was so dense that they were obliged to travel at quarter speed the entire way. It was after 10 o'clock when he dismissed the motor and entered the dingy little house with the latchkey provided by Pender. He found the hall gas turned low and the fire in the study. Books and food had also been placed ready by the servant according to instructions. Coils of fog rushed in after him through the open door and filled the hall and passage with its cold discomfort. The first thing Dr. Silence did was to lock up Smoke in the study with a saucer of milk before the fire, and then make a search of the house with Flame. The dog ran cheerfully behind him all the way, while he tried the doors of the other rooms to make sure they were locked. He nosed about into corners and made little excursions on his own account. His manner was expectant. He knew there must be something unusual about the proceeding, because it was contrary to the habits of his whole life not to be asleep at this hour on the mat in front of the fire. He kept looking up into his master's face, as door after door was tried, with an expression of intelligent sympathy, but at the same time a certain air of disapproval. Yet everything his master did was good in his eyes, and he betrayed as little impatience as possible with all this unnecessary journeying to and fro. If the doctor was pleased to play this sort of game at such an hour of the night, it was surely not for him to object. So he played it too, and was very busy and earnest about it into the bargain. After an uneventful search, they came down again to the study, and here Dr. Silence discovered Smoke washing his face calmly in front of the fire. The saucer of milk was licked dry and clean. The preliminary examination that cats always make in new surroundings had evidently been satisfactorily concluded. He drew an armchair up to the fire, stirred the coals into a blaze, arranged the table and a lamp to his satisfaction for reading, and then prepared surreptitiously to watch the animals. He wished to observe them carefully without their being aware of it. Now, in spite of their respective ages, it was the regular custom of these two to play together every night before sleep. Smoke always made the advances, beginning with grave impudence to pat the dog's tail, and Flame played cumbrously with condescension. It was his duty rather than pleasure. He was glad when it was over, and sometimes he was very determined and refused to play at all. And this night was one of the occasions on which he was firm. The doctor, looking cautiously over the top of his book, watched the cat begin the performance. It started by gazing with an innocent expression at the dog, where he lay with nose on paws and eyes wide open in the middle of the floor. Then it got up and made as though it meant to walk to the door, going deliberately and very softly. Flame's eyes followed it until it was beyond the range of sight, and then the cat turned sharply and began patting his tail tentatively with one paw. The tail moved slightly in reply, and Smoke changed paws and tapped it again. The dog, however, did not rise to play, as was his wont, and the cat fell to patting it briskly with both paws. Flame still lay motionless. This puzzled and bored the cat, and it went round and stared hard into its friend's face to see what was the matter. Perhaps some inarticulate message flashed from the dog's eyes into its own little brain, making it understand that the program for the night had better not begin with play. Perhaps it only realized that its friend was immovable. But whatever the reason, its usual persistence thenceforward deserted it, and it made no further attempts at persuasion. Smoke yielded at once to the dog's mood. It sat down where it was and began to wash. But the washing, the doctor noted, was by no means its real purpose. It only used it to mask something else. It stopped at the most busy and furious moments and began to stare about the room. Its thoughts wandered absurdly. It peered intently at the curtains, at the shadowy corners, at empty space above, leaving its body in curiously awkward positions for whole minutes together. Then it turned sharply and stared with a sudden signal of intelligence at the dog, and Flame at once rose somewhat stiffly to his feet and began to wander aimlessly and restlessly to and fro about the floor. Smoke followed him, patting quietly at his heels. Between them they made what seemed to be a deliberate search of the room. And here, as he watched them, noting carefully every detail of the performance over the top of his book, yet making no effort to interfere, it seemed to the doctor that the first beginnings of a faint distress betrayed themselves in the collie, and in the cat the stirrings of a vague excitement. He observed them closely. The fog was thick in the air, and the tobacco smoke from his pipe added to its density. The furniture at the far end stood mistily, and where the shadows congregated in hanging clouds under the ceiling, it was difficult to see clearly at all. The lamplight only reached to a level of 5 feet from the floor, above which came layers of comparative darkness, so that the room appeared twice as lofty as it actually was. By means of the lamp and the fire, however, the carpet was everywhere clearly visible. The animals made their silent tour of the floor, sometimes the dog leading, sometimes the cat. Occasionally they looked at one another as though exchanging signals, and once or twice, in spite of the limited space, he lost sight of one or other among the fog and the shadows. Their curiosity, it appeared to him, was something more than the excitement lurking in the unknown territory of a strange room. Yet so far it was impossible to test this, and he purposely kept his mind quietly receptive, lest the smallest mental excitement on his part should communicate itself to the animals, and thus destroy the value of their independent behavior. They made a very thorough journey, leaving no piece of furniture unexamined or unsmelt. Flame led the way, walking slowly with lowered head, and Smoke followed demurely at his heels, making a transparent pretense of not being interested, yet missing nothing. And at length they returned, the old collie first, and came to rest on the mat before the fire. Flame rested his muzzle on his master's knee, smiling beatifically while he patted the yellow head and spoke his name. And Smoke, coming a little later, pretending he came by chance, looked from the empty saucer to his face, lapped up the milk when it was given him to the last drop, and then sprang upon his knees and crawled round for the sleep it had fully earned and intended to enjoy. Silence descended upon the room. Only the breathing of the dog upon the mat came through the deep stillness, like the pulse of time marking the minutes, and the steady drip, drip of the fog outside upon the window ledges dismally testified to the inclemency of the night beyond, and the soft crashings of the coals as the fire settled down into the grate became less and less audible as the fire sank and the flames resigned their fierceness. It was now well after 11 o'clock, and Dr. Silence devoted himself again to his book. He read the words on the printed page, and took in their meaning superficially, yet without starting into life the correlations of thought and suggestions that should accompany interesting reading. Underneath, all the while, his mental energies were absorbed in watching, listening, waiting for what might come. He was not over-sanguine himself, yet he did not wish to be taken by surprise. Moreover, the animals, his sensitive barometers, had incontinently gone to sleep. After reading a dozen pages, however, he realized that his mind was really occupied in reviewing the features of Pender's extraordinary story, and that it was no longer necessary to steady his imagination by studying the dull paragraphs detailed in the pages before him. He laid down his book accordingly, and allowed his thoughts to dwell upon the features of the case. Speculations as to the meaning, however, he rigorously suppressed, knowing that such thoughts would act upon his imagination like wind upon the glowing embers of a fire. As the night wore on, the silence grew deeper and deeper, and only at rare intervals he heard the sound of wheels on the main road 100 yards away, where the horses went at a walking pace owing to the density of the fog. The echo of pedestrian footsteps no longer reached him, the clamor of occasional voices no longer came down the side street. The night, muffled by fog, shrouded by veils of ultimate mystery, hung about the haunted villa like a doom. Nothing in the house stirred. Stillness, in a thick blanket, lay over the upper stories. Only the mist in the room grew more dense, he thought, and the damp cold more penetrating. Certainly, from time to time, he shivered. The collie, now deep in slumber, moved occasionally, grunted, sighed, or twitched his legs in dreams. Smoke lay on his knees, a pool of warm black fur, only the closest observation detecting the movement of his sleek sides. It was difficult to distinguish exactly where his head and body joined in that circle of glistening hair. Only a black satin nose and a tiny tip of pink tongue betrayed the secret. Dr. Silence watched him and felt comfortable. The collie's breathing was soothing, the fire was well built, and would burn for another 2 hours without attention. He was not conscious of the least nervousness. He particularly wished to remain in his ordinary and normal state of mind, and to force nothing. If sleep came naturally, he would let it come, and even welcome it. The coldness of the room, when the fire died down later, would be sure to wake him again, and it would then be time enough to carry these sleeping barometers up to bed. From various psychic premonitions, he knew quite well that the night would not pass without adventure, but he did not wish to force its arrival, and he wished to remain normal and let the animals remain normal, so that when it came, it would be unattended by excitement or by any straining of the attention. Many experiments had made him wise, and for the rest, he had no fear. Accordingly, after a time, he did fall asleep as he had expected, and the last thing he remembered, before oblivion slipped up over his eyes like soft wool, was the picture of Flame stretching all 4 legs at once, and sighing noisily as he sought a more comfortable position for his paws and muzzle upon the mat. It was a good deal later when he became aware that a weight lay upon his chest and that something was penciling over his face and mouth. A soft touch on his cheek woke him. Something was patting him. He sat up with a jerk and found himself staring straight into a pair of brilliant eyes, half green, half black. Smoke's face lay level with his own, and the cat had climbed up with its front paws upon his chest. The lamp had burned low, and the fire was nearly out. Yet Dr. Silence saw in a moment that the cat was in an excited state. It kneaded with its front paws into his chest, shifting from one to the other. He felt them prodding against him. It lifted a leg very carefully and patted his cheek gingerly. Its fur, he saw, was standing ridgewise upon its back. The ears were flattened back somewhat. The tail was switching sharply. The cat, of course, had awakened him with a purpose, and the instant he realized this, he set it upon the arm of the chair and sprang up with a quick turn to face the empty room behind him. By some curious instinct, his arms, of their own accord, assumed an attitude of defense in front of him, as though to ward off something that threatened his safety. Yet nothing was visible. Only shapes of fog hung about rather heavily in the air, moving slightly to and fro. His mind was now fully alert, and the last vestiges of sleep gone. He turned the lamp higher and peered about him. Two things he became aware of at once. One, that Smoke, while excited, was pleasurably excited. The other, that the collie was no longer visible upon the mat at his feet. He had crept away to the corner of the wall farthest from the window, and lay watching the room with wide-open eyes, in which lurked plainly something of alarm. Something in the dog's behavior instantly struck Dr. Silence as unusual, and, calling him by name, he moved across to pat him. Flame got up, wagged his tail, and came over slowly to the rug, uttering a low sound that was half growl, half whine. He was evidently perturbed about something, and his master was proceeding to administer comfort when his attention was suddenly drawn to the antics of his other four-footed companion, the cat. And what he saw filled him with something like amazement. Smoke had jumped down from the back of the armchair and now occupied the middle of the carpet, where, with tail erect and legs stiff as ramrods, it was steadily pacing backwards and forwards in a narrow space, uttering as it did so those curious little guttural sounds of pleasure that only an animal of the feline species knows how to make, expressive of supreme happiness. Its stiffened legs and arched back made it appear larger than usual, and the black visage wore a smile of beatific joy. Its eyes blazed magnificently. It was in an ecstasy. At the end of every few paces, it turned sharply and stalked back again along the same line, patting softly and purring like a roll of little muffled drums. It behaved precisely as though it were rubbing against the ankles of someone who remained invisible. A thrill ran down the doctor's spine as he stood and stared. His experiment was growing interesting at last. He called the collie's attention to his friend's performance to see whether he too was aware of anything standing there upon the carpet, and the dog's behavior was significant and corroborative. He came as far as his master's knees, and then stopped dead, refusing to investigate closely. In vain Dr. Silence urged him. He wagged his tail, whined a little, and stood in a half-crouching attitude, staring alternately at the cat and at his master's face. He was, apparently, both puzzled and alarmed, and the whine went deeper and deeper down into his throat, till it changed into an ugly snarl of awakening anger. Then the doctor called to him in a tone of command he had never known to be disregarded. But still the dog, though springing up in response, declined to move nearer. He made tentative motions, pranced a little like a dog about to take water, pretended to bark, and ran to and fro on the carpet. So far there was no actual fear in his manner, but he was uneasy and anxious, and nothing would induce him to go within touching distance of the walking cat. Once he made a complete circuit, but always carefully out of reach, and in the end he returned to his master's legs and rubbed vigorously against him. Flame did not like the performance at all. That much was quite clear. For several minutes, John Silence watched the performance of the cat with profound attention and without interfering. Then he called to the animal by name. "Smoke, you mysterious beastie, what in the world are you about?" he said in a coaxing tone. The cat looked up at him for a moment, smiling in its ecstasy, blinking its eyes, but too happy to pause. He spoke to it again. He called to it several times, and each time it turned upon him its blazing eyes, drunk with inner delight, opening and shutting its lips, its body large and rigid with excitement. Yet it never for one instant paused in its short journeys to and fro. He noted exactly what it did. It walked, he saw, the same number of paces each time, some 6 or 7 steps, and then it turned sharply and retraced them. By the pattern of the great roses in the carpet he measured it. It kept to the same direction and the same line. It behaved precisely as though it were rubbing against something solid. Undoubtedly there was something standing there on that strip of carpet, something invisible to the doctor, something that alarmed the dog, yet caused the cat unspeakable pleasure. "Smoky!" he called again. "Smoky, you black mystery, what is it excites you so?" Again the cat looked up at him for a brief second, and then continued its sentry walk, blissfully happy, intensely preoccupied. And for an instant, as he watched it, the doctor was aware that a faint uneasiness stirred in the depths of his own being, focusing itself for the moment upon this curious behavior of the uncanny creature before him. There rose in him quite a new realization of the mystery connected with the whole feline tribe, but especially with that common member of it, the domestic cat, their hidden lives, their strange aloofness, their incalculable subtlety. How utterly remote from anything that human beings understood lay the sources of their elusive activities. As he watched the indescribable bearing of the little creature mincing along the strip of carpet under his eyes, coquetting with the powers of darkness, welcoming maybe some fearsome visitor, there stirred in his heart a feeling strangely akin to awe. Its indifference to humankind, its serene superiority to the obvious, struck him forcibly with fresh meaning. So remote, so inaccessible seemed the secret purposes of its real life, so alien to the blundering honesty of other animals. Its absolute poise of bearing brought into his mind the opium-eater's words that no dignity is perfect which does not at some point ally itself with the mysterious. And he became suddenly aware that the presence of the dog in this foggy, haunted room on the top of Putney Hill was uncommonly welcome to him. He was glad to feel that Flame's dependable personality was with him. The savage growling at his heels was a pleasant sound. He was glad to hear it. That marching cat made him uneasy. Finding that Smoke paid no further attention to his words, the doctor decided upon action. Would it rub against his leg too? He would take it by surprise and see. He stepped quickly forward and placed himself upon the exact strip of carpet where it walked. But no cat is ever taken by surprise. The moment he occupied the space of the intruder, setting his feet on the woven roses midway in the line of travel, Smoke suddenly stopped purring and sat down. It lifted up its face with the utmost innocent stare imaginable of its green eyes. He could have sworn it laughed. It was a perfect child again. In a single second it had resumed its simple domestic manner, and it gazed at him in such a way that he almost felt Smoke was the normal being, and his was the eccentric behavior that was being watched. It was consummate, the manner in which it brought about this change so easily and so quickly. "Superb little actor!" He laughed in spite of himself, and stooped to stroke the shining black back, but in a flash, as he touched its fur, the cat turned and spat at him viciously, striking at his hand with one paw. Then, with a hurried scutter of feet, it shot like a shadow across the floor, and a moment later was calmly sitting over by the window curtains, washing its face as though nothing interested it in the whole world but the cleanness of its cheeks and whiskers. John Silence straightened himself up and drew a long breath. He realized that the performance was temporarily at an end. The collie, meanwhile, who had watched the whole proceeding with marked disapproval, had now lain down again upon the mat by the fire, no longer growling. It seemed to the doctor just as though something that had entered the room while he slept, alarming the dog, yet bringing happiness to the cat, had now gone out again, leaving all as it was before. Whatever it was that excited its blissful attentions had retreated for the moment. He realized this intuitively. Smoke evidently realized it too, for presently he deigned to march back to the fireplace and jump upon his master's knees. Dr. Silence, patient and determined, settled down once more to his book. The animals soon slept, the fire blazed cheerfully, and the cold fog from outside poured into the room through every available chink and cranny. For a long time silence and peace reigned in the room, and Dr. Silence availed himself of the quietness to make careful notes of what had happened. He entered for future use in other cases an exhaustive analysis of what he had observed, especially with regard to the effect upon the two animals. It is impossible here, nor would it be intelligible to the reader unversed in the knowledge of the region known to a scientifically trained psychic like Dr. Silence, to detail these observations. But to him it was clear, up to a certain point. For the rest, he must still wait and watch. So far, at least, he realized that while he slept in the chair, that is, while his will was dormant, the room had suffered intrusion from what he recognized as an intensely active force, and might later be forced to acknowledge as something more than merely a blind force, namely, a distinct personality. So far, it had affected him scarcely at all, but had acted directly upon the simpler organisms of the animals. It stimulated keenly the centers of the cat's psychic being, inducing a state of instant happiness, intensifying its consciousness probably in the same way a drug or stimulant intensifies that of a human being, whereas it alarmed the less sensitive dog, causing it to feel a vague apprehension and distress. His own sudden action and exhibition of energy had served to disperse it temporarily, yet he felt convinced, the indications were not lacking even while he sat there making notes, that it still remained near to him, conditionally, if not spatially, and was, as it were, gathering force for a second attack. And further, he intuitively understood that the relations between the two animals had undergone a subtle change, that the cat had become immeasurably superior, confident, sure of itself in its own peculiar region, whereas Flame had been weakened by an attack he could not comprehend and knew not how to reply to. Though not yet afraid, he was defiant, ready to act against a fear that he felt to be approaching. He was no longer fatherly and protective towards the cat. Smoke held the key to the situation, and both he and the cat knew it. Thus, as the minutes passed, John Silence sat and waited, keenly on the alert, wondering how soon the attack would be renewed, and at what point it would be diverted from the animals and directed upon himself. The book lay on the floor beside him. His notes were complete. With one hand on the cat's fur and the dog's front paws resting against his feet, the three of them dozed comfortably before the hot fire while the night wore on and the silence deepened towards midnight. It was well after 1 o'clock in the morning when Dr. Silence turned the lamp out and lighted the candle preparatory to going up to bed. Then Smoke suddenly woke with a loud sharp purr and sat up. It neither stretched, washed, nor turned. It listened. And the doctor, watching it, realized that a certain indefinable change had come about that very moment in the room. A swift readjustment of the forces within the four walls had taken place. A new disposition of their personal equations. The balance was destroyed, the former harmony gone. Smoke, most sensitive of barometers, had been the first to feel it. But the dog was not slow to follow suit, for on looking down he noted that Flame was no longer asleep. He was lying with eyes wide open, and that same instant he sat up on his great haunches and began to growl. Dr. Silence was in the act of taking the matches to relight the lamp when an audible movement in the room behind him made him pause. Smoke leaped down from his knee and moved forward a few paces across the carpet. Then it stopped and stared fixedly, and the doctor stood up on the rug to watch. As he rose, the sound was repeated, and he discovered that it was not in the room, as he first thought, but outside, and that it came from more directions than one. There was a rushing, sweeping noise against the window panes, and simultaneously a sound of something brushing against the door out in the hall. Smoke advanced sedately across the carpet, twitching his tail, and sat down within a foot of the door. The influence that had destroyed the harmonious conditions of the room had apparently moved in advance of its cause. Clearly, something was about to happen. For the first time that night, John Silence hesitated. The thought of that dark, narrow hallway, choked with fog and destitute of human comfort, was unpleasant. He became aware of a faint creeping of his flesh. He knew, of course, that the actual opening of the door was not necessary to the invasion of the room that was about to take place, since neither doors nor windows, nor any other solid barriers, could interpose an obstacle to what was seeking entrance. Yet the opening of the door would be significant and symbolic, and he distinctly shrank from it. But for a moment only. Smoke, turning with the show of impatience, recalled him to his purpose, and he moved past the sitting, watching creature and deliberately opened the door to its full width. What subsequently happened in the feeble and flickering light of the solitary candle on the mantelpiece. Through the opened door he saw the hall, dimly lit and thick with fog. Nothing, of course, was visible, nothing but the hat-stand, the African spears in dark lines upon the wall, and the high-backed wooden chair standing grotesquely underneath on the oilcloth floor. For one instant the fog seemed to move and thicken oddly, but he set that down to the score of the imagination. The door had opened upon nothing. Yet Smoke apparently thought otherwise, and the deep growling of the collie from the mat at the back of the room seemed to confirm his judgment. For, proud and self-possessed, the cat had again risen to his feet, and, having advanced to the door, was now ushering someone slowly into the room. Nothing could have been more evident. He paced from side to side, bowing his little head with great empressement, and holding his stiffened tail aloft like a flagstaff. He turned this way and that, mincing to and fro, and showing signs of supreme satisfaction. He was in his element. He welcomed the intrusion, and apparently reckoned that his companions, the doctor and the dog, would welcome it likewise. The intruder had returned for a second attack. Dr. Silence moved slowly backwards and took up his position on the hearthrug, keying himself up to a condition of concentrated attention. He noted that Flame stood beside him, facing the room with body motionless and head moving swiftly from side to side with a curious swaying movement. His eyes were wide open, his back rigid, his neck and jaws thrust forward, his legs tense and ready to leap. Savage, ready for attack or defense, yet dreadfully puzzled, and perhaps already a little cowed, he stood and stared, the hair on his spine and sides positively bristling outwards as though a wind played through it. In the dim firelight he looked like a great yellow-haired wolf, silent, eyes shooting dark fire, exceedingly formidable. It was Flame, the Terrible. Smoke, meanwhile, advanced from the door towards the middle of the room, adopting the very slow pace of an invisible companion. A few feet away it stopped and began to smile and blink its eyes. There was something deliberately coaxing in its attitude as it stood there undecided on the carpet, clearly wishing to effect some sort of introduction between the intruder and its canine friend and ally. It assumed its most winning manners, purring, smiling, looking persuasively from one to the other, and making quick, tentative steps, first in one direction and then in the other. There had always existed such perfect understanding between them in everything. Surely Flame would appreciate Smoke's intention now and acquiesce. But the old collie made no advances. He bared his teeth, lifting his lips till the gums showed, and stood stock still with fixed eyes and heaving sides. The doctor moved a little farther back, watching intently the smallest movement, and it was just then he divined suddenly from the cat's behavior and attitude that it was not only a single companion it had ushered into the room, but several. It kept crossing over from one to the other, looking up at each in turn. It sought to win over the dog to friendliness with them all. The original intruder had come back with reinforcements, and at the same time he further realized that the intruder was something more than a blindly acting force, impersonal though destructive. It was a personality, and moreover a great personality, and it was accompanied, for the purposes of assistance, by a host of other personalities, minor in degree but similar in kind. He braced himself in the corner against the mantelpiece and waited, his whole being roused to defense, for he was now fully aware that the attack had spread to include himself as well as the animals, and he must be on the alert. He strained his eyes through the foggy atmosphere, trying in vain to see what the cat and dog saw, but the candlelight threw an uncertain and flickering light across the room, and his eyes discerned nothing. On the floor, Smoke moved softly in front of him like a black shadow, his eyes gleaming as he turned his head, still trying with many insinuating gestures and much purring to bring about the introductions he desired. But it was all in vain. Flame stood riveted to one spot, motionless as a figure carved in stone. Some minutes passed, during which only the cat moved, and then there came a sharp change. Flame began to back towards the wall. He moved his head from side to side as he went, sometimes turning to snap at something almost behind him. They were advancing upon him, trying to surround him. His distress became very marked from now onwards, and it seemed to the doctor that his anger merged into genuine terror and became overwhelmed by it. The savage growl sounded perilously like a whine, and more than once he tried to dive past his master's legs, as though hunting for a way of escape. He was trying to avoid something that everywhere blocked the way. This terror of the indomitable fighter impressed the doctor enormously, yet also painfully, stirring his impatience, for he had never before seen the dog show signs of giving in, and it distressed him to witness it. He knew, however, that he was not giving in easily, and understood that it was really impossible for him to gauge the animal's sensations properly at all. What Flame felt and saw must be terrible indeed to turn him all at once into a coward. He faced something that made him afraid of more than his life merely. The doctor spoke a few quick words of encouragement to him, and stroked the bristling hair, but without much success. The collie seemed already beyond the reach of comfort such as that, and the collapse of the old dog followed indeed very speedily after this. And Smoke, meanwhile, remained behind, watching the advance, but not joining in it, sitting, pleased and expectant, considering that all was going well and as it wished. It was kneading on the carpet with its front paws, slowly, laboriously, as though its feet were dipped in treacle. The sound its claws made as they caught in the threads was distinctly audible. It was smiling, blinking, purring. Suddenly, the collie uttered a poignant, short bark and leaped heavily to one side. His bare teeth traced a line of whiteness through the gloom. The next instant, he dashed past his master's legs, almost upsetting his balance, and shot out into the room, where he went blundering wildly against walls and furniture. But that bark was significant. The doctor had heard it before and knew what it meant, for it was the cry of the fighter against odds, and it meant that the old beast had found his courage again. Possibly it was only the courage of despair, but at any rate the fighting would be terrific. And Dr. Silence understood, too, that he dared not interfere. Flame must fight his own enemies in his own way. But the cat, too, had heard that dreadful bark, and it, too, had understood. This was more than it had bargained for. Across the dim shadows of that haunted room there must have passed some secret signal of distress between the animals. Smoke stood up and looked swiftly about him. He uttered a piteous meow and trotted smartly away into the greater darkness by the windows. What his object was, only those endowed with the spirit-like intelligence of cats might know. But at any rate, he had at last ranged himself on the side of his friend, and the little beast meant business. At the same moment, the collie managed to gain the door. The doctor saw him rush through into the hall like a flash of yellow light. He shot across the oilcloth and tore up the stairs, but in another second he appeared again, flying down the steps and landing at the bottom in a tumbling heap, whining, cringing, terrified. The doctor saw him slink back into the room again and crawl round by the wall towards the cat. Was then even the staircase occupied? Did they stand also in the hall? Was the whole house crowded from floor to ceiling? The thought came to add to the keen distress he felt at the sight of the collie's discomfiture. And indeed, his own personal distress had increased in a marked degree during the past minutes, and continued to increase steadily to the climax. He recognized that the drain on his own vitality grew steadily, and that the attack was now directed against himself even more than against the defeated dog and the too much deceived cat. It all seemed so rapid and uncalculated after that, the events that took place in this little modern room at the top of Putney Hill between midnight and sunrise, that Dr. Silence was hardly able to follow and remember it all. It came about with such uncanny swiftness and terror. The light was so uncertain, the movements of the black cat so difficult to follow on the dark carpet, and the doctor himself so wary and taken by surprise, that he found it almost impossible to observe accurately, or to recall afterwards precisely what it was he had seen or in what order the incidents had taken place. He never could understand what defect of vision on his part made it seem as though the cat had duplicated itself at first, and then increased indefinitely, so that there were at least a dozen of them darting silently about the floor, leaping softly onto chairs and tables, passing like shadows from the open door to the end of the room, all black as sin, with brilliant green eyes flashing fire in all directions. It was like the reflections from a score of mirrors placed around the walls at different angles. Nor could he make out at the time why the size of the room seemed to have altered, grown much larger, and why it extended away behind him where ordinarily the wall should have been. The snarling of the enraged and terrified collie sounded sometimes so far away. The ceiling seemed to have raised itself so much higher than before, and much of the furniture had changed in appearance and shifted marvelously. It was all so confused and confusing, as though the little room he knew had become merged and transformed into the dimensions of quite another chamber, that came to him, with its host of cats and its strange distances, in a sort of vision. But these changes came about a little later, and at a time when his attention was so concentrated upon the proceedings of Smoke and the collie that he only observed them, as it were, subconsciously. And the excitement, the flickering candlelight, the distress he felt for the collie, and the distorting atmosphere of fog were the poorest possible allies to careful observation. At first he was only aware that the dog was repeating his short, dangerous bark from time to time, snapping viciously at the empty air a foot or so from the ground. Once, indeed, he sprang upwards and forwards, working furiously with teeth and paws, and with the noise like wolves fighting, but only to dash back the next minute against the wall behind him. Then, after lying still for a bit, he rose to a crouching position, as though to spring again, snarling horribly and making short half-circles with lowered head. And Smoke, all the while, meowed piteously by the window, as though trying to draw the attack upon himself. Then it was that the rush of the whole dreadful business seemed to turn aside from the dog and direct itself upon his own person. The collie had made another spring, and fallen back with a crash into the corner, where he made noise enough in his savage rage to waken the dead before he fell to whining, and then finally lay still. And directly afterwards the doctor's own distress became intolerably acute. He had made a half-movement forward to come to the rescue when a veil that was denser than mere fog seemed to drop down over the scene, draping room, walls, animals, and fire in a mist of darkness, and folding also about his own mind. Other forms moved silently across the field of vision, forms that he recognized from previous experiments and welcomed not. Unholy thoughts began to crowd into his brain, sinister suggestions of evil presented themselves seductively. Ice seemed to settle about his heart, and his mind trembled. He began to lose memory of his identity, of where he was, of what he ought to do. The very foundations of his strength were shaken, his will seemed paralyzed. And it was then that the room filled with this horde of cats, all dark as the night, all silent, all with lamping eyes of green fire. The dimensions of the place altered and shifted. He was in a much larger space. The whining of the dog sounded far away, and all about him the cats flew busily to and fro, silently playing their tearing, rushing game of evil, weaving the pattern of their dark purpose upon the floor. He strove hard to collect himself and remember the words of power he had made use of before in similar dread positions where his dangerous practice had sometimes led. But he could recall nothing consecutively. A mist lay over his mind and memory. He felt dazed, and his forces scattered. The deeps within were too troubled for healing power to come out of them. It was glamour, of course, he realized afterwards, the strong glamour thrown upon his imagination by some powerful personality behind the veil. But at the time he was not sufficiently aware of this, and, as with all true glamour, was unable to grasp where the true ended and the false began. He was caught momentarily in the same vortex that had sought to lure the cat to destruction through its delight, and threatened utterly to overwhelm the dog through its terror. There came a sound in the chimney behind him, like wind booming and tearing its way down. The windows rattled, the candle flickered and went out. The glacial atmosphere closed round him with the cold of death, and a great rushing sound swept by overhead as though the ceiling had lifted to a great height. He heard the door shut. Far away it sounded. He felt lost, shelterless, in the depths of his soul. Yet still he held out and resisted, while the climax of the fight came nearer and nearer. He had stepped into the stream of forces awakened by Pender, and he knew that he must withstand them to the end, or come to a conclusion that it was not good for a man to come to. Something from the region of utter cold was upon him. And then quite suddenly, through the confused mists about him, there slowly rose up the personality that had been all the time directing the battle. Some force entered his being that shook him as the tempest shakes a leaf, and close against his eyes, clean level with his face, he found himself staring into the wreck of a vast dark countenance, a countenance that was terrible even in its ruin. For ruined it was, and terrible it was, and the mark of spiritual evil was branded everywhere upon its broken features. Eyes, face, and hair rose level with his own, and for a space of time he never could properly measure or determine, these two, a man and a woman, looked straight into each other's visages and down into each other's hearts. And John Silence, the soul with the good, unselfish motive, held his own against the dark, discarnate woman whose motive was pure evil and whose soul was on the side of the dark powers. It was the climax that touched the depth of power within him and began to restore him slowly to his own. He was conscious, of course, of effort, and yet it seemed no superhuman one, for he had recognized the character of his opponent's power and called upon the good within him to meet and overcome it. The inner forces stirred and trembled in response to his call. They did not at first come readily, as was their habit, for under the spell of glamour they had already been diabolically lulled into inactivity. But come they eventually did, rising out of the inner spiritual nature he had learned with so much time and pain to awaken to life, and power and confidence came with them. He began to breathe deeply and regularly, and at the same time to absorb into himself the forces opposed to him and to turn them to his own account. By ceasing to resist and allowing the deadly stream to pour into him unopposed, he used the very power supplied by his adversary, and thus enormously increased his own. For this spiritual alchemy he had learned. He understood that force ultimately is everywhere one and the same. It is the motive behind that makes it good or evil, and his motive was entirely unselfish. He knew, provided he was not first robbed of self-control, how vicariously to absorb these evil radiations into himself and change them magically into his own good purposes. And since his motive was pure and his soul fearless, they could not work him harm. Thus he stood in the main stream of evil, unwittingly attracted by Pender, deflecting its course upon himself. And after passing through the purifying filter of his own unselfishness, these energies could only add to his store of experience, of knowledge, and therefore of power. And as his self-control returned to him, he gradually accomplished this purpose, even though trembling while he did so. Yet the struggle was severe, and in spite of the freezing chill of the air, the perspiration poured down his face. Then, by slow degrees, the dark and dreadful countenance faded, the glamour passed from his soul, the normal proportions returned to walls and a ceiling, the forms melted back into the fog, and the whirl of rushing shadow-cats disappeared whence they came. And with the return of the consciousness of his own identity, John Silence was restored to the full control of his own willpower. In a deep, modulated voice, he began to utter certain rhythmical sounds that slowly rolled through the air like a rising sea, filling the room with powerful vibratory activities that whelmed all irregularities of lesser vibrations in its own swelling tone. He made certain sigils, gestures, and movements at the same time. For several minutes he continued to utter these words, until at length the growing volume dominated the whole room and mastered the manifestation of all that opposed it. For just as he understood the spiritual alchemy that can transmute evil forces by raising them into higher channels, so he knew from long study the occult use of sound and its direct effect upon the plastic region wherein the powers of spiritual evil worked their fell purposes. Harmony was restored first of all to his own soul, and thence to the room and all its occupants. And after himself, the first to recognize it was the old dog lying in his corner. Flame began suddenly uttering sounds of pleasure, that something between a growl and a grunt that dogs make upon being restored to their master's confidence. Dr. Silence heard the thumping of the collie's tail against the floor, and the grunt and the thumping touched the depth of affection in the man's heart, and gave him some inkling of what agonies the dumb creature had suffered. Next, from the shadows by the window, a somewhat shrill purring announced the restoration of the cat to its normal state. Smoke was advancing across the carpet. He seemed very pleased with himself, and smiled with an expression of supreme innocence. He was no shadow cat, but real and full of his usual and perfect self-possession. He marched along, picking his way delicately, but with a stately dignity that suggested his ancestry with the majesty of Egypt. His eyes no longer glared. They shone steadily before him. They radiated not excitement, but knowledge. Clearly, he was anxious to make amends for the mischief to which he had unwittingly lent himself, owing to his subtle and electric constitution. Still uttering his sharp, high purrings, he marched up to his master and rubbed vigorously against his legs. Then he stood on his hind feet and pawed his knees and stared beseechingly up into his face. He turned his head towards the corner where the collie still lay, thumping his tail feebly and pathetically. John Silence understood. He bent down and stroked the creature's living fur, noting the line of bright blue sparks that followed the motion of his hand down its back, and then they advanced together towards the corner where the dog was. Smoke went first and put his nose gently against his friend's muzzle, purring while he rubbed, and uttering little soft sounds of affection in his throat. The doctor lit the candle and brought it over. He saw the collie lying on his side against the wall. It was utterly exhausted, and foam still hung about its jaws. Its tail and eyes responded to the sound of its name, but it was evidently very weak and overcome. Smoke continued to rub against its cheek and nose and eyes, sometimes even standing on its body and kneading into the thick yellow hair. Flame replied from time to time by little licks of the tongue, most of them curiously misdirected. But Dr. Silence felt intuitively that something disastrous had happened, and his heart was wrung. He stroked the dear body, feeling it over for bruises or broken bones, but finding none. He fed it with what remained of the sandwiches and milk, but the creature clumsily upset the saucer and lost the sandwiches between its paws, so that the doctor had to feed it with his own hand. And all the while Smoke meowed piteously. Then John Silence began to understand. He went across to the farther side of the room and called aloud to it. "Flame, old man, come!" At any other time the dog would have been upon him in an instant, barking and leaping to the shoulder, and even now he got up, though heavily and awkwardly, to his feet. He started to run, wagging his tail more briskly. He collided first with a chair, and then ran straight into a table. Smoke trotted close to his side, trying his very best to guide him, but it was useless. Dr. Silence had to lift him up into his own arms and carry him like a baby, for he was blind.